So did spiritual gifts cease with the completing of the biblical canon? Absolutely, categorically no. That is an exegetically unsound viewpoint, a theologically unsound viewpoint, a historically unsound viewpoint. First, when we just look at the text itself, the biblical text tells us things like we should pray for the sick. In James, Jacob, the 5th chapter, never tells us that we should stop praying for the sick or that the prayer of faith would no longer save the sick and heal the sick. And 1 Corinthians 14, we're urged to not forbid speaking in tongues and to earnestly desire to prophesy. Who changed that? Where in the Bible did that change? 1 Thessalonians 5 tells us not to put out the Spirit's fire, not to despise prophecies, but to test everything and hold to the good. Who changed that? No one, no church group, no council, no later revelation, Book of Mormon or some other thing, or alleged prophetic word has the authority to overturn what's written. And what's written says pursue spiritual gifts. And what's written even tells us that the spiritual gifts will continue until Jesus comes. When Paul commends the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 1:7, he's commending them for excelling in the spiritual gifts until Jesus returns. Now look at this, 1 Corinthians 13, which actually reinforces that the gifts will not cease until Jesus returns. Let me show you how this verse is completely ripped out of context. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, Paul writes this: love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. Some say the perfect, that's the completing of the New Testament canon. As one New Testament scholar said, Paul could not have been writing about something of which he had no knowledge. There's no concept of a New Testament canon when he was writing his letter to the Corinthians, okay? There was no consciousness, I'm writing a letter which is going to be part of this book that's called the New Testament. Of course not. But not only so, look at what it says. All right, we know in part, we prophesy in part, and Paul goes on in this passage and says, then when the perfect comes, we'll know God as he knows us, and we'll see face to face. We don't see face to face. We don't see God face to face right now or know him the way he knows us. That's why we still have differences. That's why we still have teachers. That's why we still have denominations that separate over this. That's why we still have a discussion about the spiritual gifts, because the perfect hasn't come. The perfect is the coming of Jesus when he establishes his perfect kingdom on the earth. And at that point, we won't need tongues and we won't need prophets anymore. So of course they continue until the Son of God returns. Not only so, tongues, prophecy are well attested, healing, miracles, deliverances, after the last book of the New Testament was written, after the last of the first 12 apostles and Paul all died. Attested in church history for centuries, even on and off through church history, and widely attested by the hundreds of millions around the world today for the last 100+ years. So yes, the gifts continue. The idea that they cease when the canon is closed is a ridiculous argument that has hardly ever been known or taught in church history until, the last century or so, and it is increasingly a view that people do not hold to.